Today I'll be teaching you how to make this tailored vest with just a single piece of fabric and minimal sewing. First, I measure out my hips, then my waist, then I measure out my chest. Then I lay out my fabric. You want to have it folded over on the long ways so that this creates two halves. You want to align your shoulders with the part that's folded over and get as close to the edge as you can, and then trace out the general shape of one side of your body. I recommend using chalk because you can easily erase it once you're done. Next, I'm just going to go in and clean up my line. You can also erase some of this with a wet towel. Then I'm going to take those measurements from earlier. I'm going to cut them in half. I added about 2 or 3 inches, but it turned out way too tight, so I recommend adding 4 to maybe even 5 inches to account for sewing and human error. Then I'm going to take my hip measurement from where my hip is and add a point. Then my waist measurement from where my waist is on the line. And I'm going to add point there as well. And then the same thing with my chest measurement. Now that I've cleaned up my line a little bit more, I'm going to cut out this general shape on this side. A tip here is you want to cut the armholes larger than you think you're going to need the armholes. Now that I've got that cut out, I'm going to fold it until those points line up with the shape of this. Since it doesn't perfectly line up, I'm going to go a little bit out and kind of in the middle from where the points are. This should give you a very symmetrical vest. I also snipped the middle to mark where the middle is. Now here I used bowls. Depending on the size of your neck, you can use pretty much anything. And I want to talk about another thing that I did here that I did wrong. So what I did correctly here was I measured out the bowl, I measured where it would go, so that's perfectly in the center. And that's good. I want it to be in the center along the shoulders. However, what I did wrong is I put it halfway down, so that half of the bowl would be cut out, making a full circle for the neck hole, which is not what you want. What you want is to have a kind of half football shape. You don't want it a full semicircle because that'll make it go far too low down on your back. Now to get each side cut properly, I'm going to fold it over so that the edges line up. And then I'm going to mark it with a piece of chalk. Once I unfold it, I should have a mark at the bottom and my mark from earlier at the very top. Now I can just draw a straight line down the middle. Now I'm going to cut out the neck hole. I'm going to be cutting both pieces of fabric. Again, that shouldn't look like a semicircle like I did it. It should look more like a football shape. Now, I'm only going to cut the front piece of metal, or fabric. I'm only cutting the front piece of fabric, leaving the bottom intact for the front flaps that will be buttoned together later. I realized I made a mistake when making this brown one that I'm making in the video, and that is I was supposed to cut this hole a lot more shallow like this. I cut this more like a circle when it's supposed to be more of a football shape. Step one, as always, is remove cats. So first I want to line these up as best as I can, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but try and get it as close as you can get it to being perfect. These bottom lines don't line up quite right, and that's fine. I can always trim these later. One thing to note is you want to make the armpit holes larger than you think you're going to need the armpit holes. Right there is where I have this cut to where I'd want to sew, but I'm actually just going to sew down to there, because I can always sew them up more later. But for now, that is probably as far as I would like to sew. I left this straight part unsewed so that these could kind of flap out. I started my sewing there and stopped before I got to that notch, leaving a very large armhole. And same for this other side. I'm just going to fold it down and line up all of these edges as best as I can. I'm going to sew along the edge. For the sake of symmetricality, I folded it over so that I could get the exact same start and stop points. Now, once again, I'm just going to sew from those points. Next I'm going to fold over and hem these shoulder edges. Some people will pin these in place and some people will skip this step entirely. It's completely up to you. I'm going to take that off so that I can get this into the sewing machine a bit better. Fold over these edges. Folding this over about a ½ an inch, I'm kind of just eyeballing it, doesn't have to be super exact, then sewing it down in place. Especially since I'm eyeballing this, I'm just going to double check the symmetry of this and make sure that those seams are lining up in a symmetrical way, and so far they are. Some of my edges here are a bit wobbly and weird, so I'm just going to trim a lot of this off. You can hem the rest of this like this edge and the neck hole, but for the sake of this video, I'm not going to. Then you just flip it inside out. To mark out my buttonholes, I'm just going to put this on. And bring this to where I want buttons. There and there seem like good spots. Then where I marked with chalk, I'm going to take my scissors and cut a tiny hole, smaller than I probably will want my button because I can always cut it larger. Then I'm going to fold this over so that these overlap. I'm going to mark through the hole I just made where each of my buttons should go. That's where I'm going to sew on my buttons. So now I'm going to sew on the buttons. I already sewed one on, and I'll show you how to do it. You want to come up through right where you made that mark, and I like to make a little X below where I'm going to put the button to make sure that doesn't pull through the fabric. Now I'm just going to reinforce and hem this buttonhole to make sure that my buttons don't pull straight through this. And I think my sewing machine might have a setting to do this, but I've always done it by hand. And that's it. You can hem these edges to make it fold out this nicely. I didn't iron this. You can also just cut holes here and add buttons if you don't want to iron it. And that's basically it for this video. I tried to use as little sewing as possible, so that's why very few edges are actually sewn and hemmed. As always, have fun.